Well, it is with a bittersweet sense that I announce our final speaker. And so it has been a very good couple of days, and we are going to end on a very rich note. Also with Christa Mahlobo, my colleague in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, who is a Penn Provost postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Pennsylvania. She will be talking to us on the topic of exploring barriers and engagement in Black American art survey insights. So over to you, Christa. Oh, by the way, thank you, Christa, for leading the meditation this morning. So she was beginning from 10 minutes. So
it still works because of course I dropped it 10 seconds before it started. Okay, it still works. Well, I'll leave the wrapping up for the conference to James, but I will say I was telling someone yesterday that this is the best conference I've ever been to. And it's not because I was on the team that, you know, part in planning it, but it genuinely was just a beautiful meeting of minds. So thank you to everyone who's presented. I've learned so much and been so inspired from hearing your case studies and hearing about your research. So thank you. So today I'll be talking a little bit of about some of the projects that I've been doing, but then also asking you to do some reflection on belonging, essentially. So I'll go through a little bit of background about why I chose to study what I'm studying. I'll talk again through some projects and then have you all reflect. So I wanted to begin with a story. So many of you, I hope, are familiar with the woman on the screen. This is Dr. Maya Angelou. And this is a picture of her holding one of her most famous books, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. It's fabulous. But in the book, she tells the story of her life, essentially. And she talks about how at the age of 8, she went mute as a result of an incredibly traumatic event that happened in her life. So of course, those in her family and those in her community were incredibly concerned that she had just stopped talking, but they found it really hard or impossible, rather, to get her to resume speaking. So Maya was mute for about 5 years until she met her teacher, Miss Flowers, who was her English teacher, and she encouraged her to read and write poetry, saying, words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes human voices to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning, which I think in and of itself is very poetic. But from there, Maya slowly started to find her voice. So she really credited the arts here for saving her life. In response to this really traumatic event and the hardship that she experienced over her life as a Black woman, she says that the arts really liberated her. So I start by telling her story because while Dr. Angelou's story is in some ways unique, in other ways, it's really one of the many examples of how Black Americans have really used the arts throughout history to transmute suffering, but then also heal from some of these structural and interpersonal violence that often happens as a result of living in the United States. So during the conference, I feel like we've talked a lot about the role of the arts in flourishing, but there are other dimensions of flourishing that I think are really important for us to consider, particularly when thinking about the role that the arts have played in Black American flourishing. So we kind of touched on this a little bit yesterday during sort of the last part of the conference, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more today. But I think in order to do that, it's really important to highlight some of these really noteworthy features of Black American arts traditions across the diaspora, which, like a lot of other Indigenous traditions, were born out of really the collectivist nature of the cultures, but then, the often unjust and challenging social environments that Black Americans often experience. And some of these features include storytelling and community gathering, healing from trauma, individual and community liberation, and also sometimes the arts serve as this call to action. So starting with storytelling, the activist Angela Davis writes that the arts for many Black folks have been used as tools for collective expression and collective desire, and also as a way to preserve cultural memory. So as an example, in Western Africa, they had griots, and griots were these ancestral historians who were able to tell history, but then also talk about current events. And they did this through the arts. So they did this through poetry, through storytelling, through singing and dancing. And I think that this is a really interesting tradition because in many ways, this oral tradition carries on in modern day hip hop in a lot of ways. So modern day hip hop is really just the practice of storytelling and bearing witness that a lot of Black inner city youth have utilized. And there's an aspect here too of using the arts as a way really to bring people together. So a lot of the community was gathered in a meaningful way, as is an important goal of many collectivist cultures. So a second feature or use or outcome of arts engagement for many Black Americans has been its ability to heal from trauma, particularly healing from the trauma of historical oppression and the transmutation of suffering or the transformation of suffering. So I'll read an excerpt from Dr. Camilla Majid's book, Joyfully Just, where she talks about Negro spirituals and gospel music. And she says, transcending the legacy of bondage and ongoing exploitation and violence against us, Black people lift all spirits with Black spirituals. Black gospel music elevates the hope of humanity and calls us to create an immovable resolve within, based on our inherent divinity and dignity, and the determination to see that dignity and divinity triumph. Declaring that we shall not be moved, we hold firm to our resolve to be free. And I'll point out that even though Negro spirituals were often used during slavery as a way for Black folks to communicate sorrow, communicate with each other, express hope, sorrow, pain. As Dr. Majid states, these songs also uplift the spirits of all, and they're often used in many resistance movements and marches to freedom around the world today. And this leads to the third point, that the arts can and have been used by Black Americans to liberate. So the arts have been one of the few spaces where Black folks have been allowed a voice, and with that platform, they have reflected a commitment to complete liberation. So these art forms and engagement with the art forms are also self-transcendent. So we kind of touched on self-transcendence a little bit today, but from Black gospel music, for example, we invoke this determination and commitment to our spiritual selves. And these practices are also really embodied, right? So they incorporate your physical being, like the way that African drum beats call us to action, and they really invite this embodied liberation through movement, or the way that jazz really encourages us to live and to color outside of the lines. So as James Baldwin beautifully puts it, all art is a kind of confession. All artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit the anguish up. And finally, the arts have been used as a call to action and a resistance to subjugation. So really another way to think about it is that it is used as a wisdom tradition with justice at its core. And many artistic works within Black culture have been very subversive or counterculture in a sense, just really challenging the way that the American mainstream is forced to think deeply about its race problem. But then it also encourages Black Americans in the resistance of these really daily attempts to devalue or even end Black lives. So I think this poem by Lucille Clifton beautifully illustrates this point. And she says, "Come celebrate with me, that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." So these flourishing outcomes that Black Americans reap from engaging with the arts don't necessarily neatly fit into these categories of flourishing that we're most primed to talk about, right? So we often hear about the psychological benefits, the physical and the interpersonal benefits of flourishing. But really, the benefits of some of these features describe something else entirely. So in line with this thinking, I think it's really important to use models of flourishing that are really contextualized for the population of interest. So in my work with Black Americans, then, I often use the multidimensional contextual model of well-being. And the model includes these different dimensions of well-being that emerge from the literature in multicultural psychology. So it was really developed to meet the need for a model that includes flourishing in ways that are important to folks from collectivist cultures, like many folks from the African or African diaspora cultures. So when we think about flourishing in these groups, of course, we think about the typical dimensions of flourishing, as I mentioned, psychological, physical, and interpersonal. But I think it's also important to think about transcendent and collective flourishing. So transcendent flourishing can include religiosity and spirituality and the many ways that people experience well-being through religious and spiritual engagement. So that can include finding meaning, purpose, flow, and awe. And people do this through different practices, rites, and rituals. And historically, this is a really important dimension, but it's also really tied to the lives of Black Americans today. So historically, this was really tied to Black liberation through the civil rights movement, but then also contemporarily, this dimension still serves that purpose of deepening connections to a higher power, but then also it plays an active role in creating hope and also coping with stressful events, such as racial discrimination. And then we've got collective flourishing. So it's a second dimension that I think we should really consider when we talk about flourishing in the Black community, and it describes having a healthy sense of sociocultural identity. So in this context, if you're thinking about Black Americans, you can think of it as having a strong sense of ethnic racial pride. You can also think a bit about, or you can also think of it as being connected to the community in a broader sense. So having positive feelings about individuals within your ethnic group. And then the final sort of part of it is having a sense of civic participation or engagement. So really working to make a change within your community. And while I'm using this model of collective flourishing to talk specifically about Black Americans, in other marginalized groups, you can switch out this identity to any sort of identity that you really want to focus on. So, considering what I've told you about these different dimensions of flourishing, I wanted you to think a little bit about your prior experiences with the arts and think about how they might have impacted your transcendent or collective, so your identity-based flourishing. And you can think perhaps about whatever the piece was, and it could be, it's arts agnostic, so it doesn't matter if it was music, if it was literature, if it was a movie that you watched, but just think about, have you had experiences with the arts that impacted your transcendent or collective identity-based flourishing? So find a neighbor or partner in the room and chat about it.
Very logistics, adding and not. I joined here. Yeah, it's well talked. Like it's always so interesting. No, I'm not leaving. I'm just. I'm fine. Things are recorded. There's a whole worksheet that basically goes through. Are the Williams stay solid? I feel like I have a weird identity. I mean, it's certainly I'm very honest person. And both the teaching experience.
So I mean, that's it.
I feel like it's gonna.
I feel
Yeah, I think that way. And so I don't know.
So I'm not
Okay, it's more like. So. Yeah.
Because sometimes. Yeah, you talk about something.
That's not something that I realized. Okay, my background never like. Yeah. No, I have I'm not. And I think about it, or something. And the other side, especially like, I mean, like, it was like, oh, like thinking about, like, yeah, and so. It's just like, and she. Yeah. I was thinking. Yeah, so it's all up to you. Your like definition. That's what I want to like someone else like really wrong. But describe that. Not knowing it. How did you find out? But responding to. I agree. Well. Okay, yeah.
Take about 34 seconds, wrap up your
And she does it very well, so I love to see that because.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I just did like how it's generational. Around. No, I feel like grants, but I see how really about.
All right, bring it back.
Right, I think that's really fascinating, it's really exciting, yeah, it was for her life today. Yeah. I need to go upstairs.
Yeah, I feel like everyone in here could actually. I love that. So, I want to hear some of the conversations, if you feel comfortable sharing, of course, some of the conversations that you had. But also I'd love to throw another question in here, which is, outside of me talking about transcendent and collective flourishing today, is this something that you think about when you think about arts engagement and its impact on either yourself or the communities that you're working with? So I'd love to hear both that question, but then also maybe some experiences that you've had with the arts that impacted your flourishing in those ways.
Well, since we're talking about visual arts, we moved into an all-white neighborhood when I was 4 years old, the 24-hour police protection. The Norman Rockwell picture is something I identify with. Because that was me, but just in a different place. Our family was also on the front page of the New York Times, and Dr. Benjamin Hooks called my dad to ask if we would be the test case before the Supreme Court, because we moved into that house before the Fair Housing Act. And so that whole experience was, in a way, part of my life, though we were never as famous. So.
Thank you for sharing.
Think when I was in art school, I finished in the late 90s, and it was the AIDS epidemic, and there was a lot of art being made at that point, especially by gay men, that was really valuable and memorable, but also like in our conversation, I was talking about Karen Finley's performance after she'd been censored by Jesse Helms and others in Congress. And I think that those emergences of like collective, like queer identity or feminist identity, were really important to me to seek out at that point.
Yeah, thank you. And I love both of your examples too, because something that I didn't mention, but James sort of told us yesterday was that when we say flourishing, we don't just mean that these experiences are going to evoke these happy feelings or well-being. Sometimes they have you grapple with sometimes really delicate or hard things about your identity or about your life. So thank you for sharing those.
I actually didn't have a chance to share my group, but I'll share it here because we're talking about some of this collective and these issues. So I mentioned that my parents were from Indonesia, and my mom's side of the family had been batik makers. They were making batik fabric for 8 generations. And then over time, a lot of the arts started getting suppressed or becoming illegal or whatever. And so my family collected and tried to secure a lot of artwork to prevent it from being destroyed. So most of it's folk art. A lot of statues of various sorts. Some are Buddhist, some are Hindu. There's a lot from the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and shadow puppets, and then all kinds of paintings from the first presidency after the Dutch colonialist era. So those are Sukarno. But it was so very distant. It was difficult for me to relate with in some ways because there's hardly any Indonesian culture or community here in the United States. It's extremely rare for any gamelan orchestra to come, and usually it was like 1,000 miles away from where I was. And there are hardly any Indonesian restaurants. Well, there are a few here in Philadelphia, New York, but so to me, growing up, I saw myself as American, but I had this distant connection with being Indonesian and being Chinese. There wasn't really much of a Chinese culture in Pittsburgh either. So later on when I got married, some of these issues really started popping up. It's funny how issues start popping up when you get married and you start having kids. That really starts happening. So when I was in Bucharest, Romania, I then started going to all these the folk festivals and everything. I just love the folk dancing, the music, and I started learning how to play folk Romanian pieces. Yeah, and then I came back here. I've been performing various Romanian festivals since. It looks funny because I'm an Asian guy wearing Romanian outfits, but some of the only violence.
I love that.
So, anyways, I just
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you all for sharing. Honestly, I love asking this question to people because people's faces light up when you talk about your experiences with the arts. So thank you for sharing that with me. That is part of the reason that I was really interested in focusing on this. So when I first proposed that I wanted to work in the lab with James and Catherine, I said, hey, I'm really interested in the role of the arts in flourishing, but I really want to take this very expansive view of flourishing, particularly because I think transcendent and collective flourishing are super important for Black Americans. So that was one of the first questions that I proposed, and I decided to do that exploration via a scoping review. So there were so many results from the scoping review. I have literally talked for 30 to 45 minutes on the results, but I'll give you just a really quick version of the results that I found. So I wanted to look at what are the impacts of the arts across all domains on Black American flourishing across those 5 domains that I talked about. And we found evidence that the arts were being engaged in, essentially in lots of different domains, but we categorized them into 4. So we saw that the majority of the articles that we found were dedicated to the exploration of the impact of television and film on Black well-being and ill-being. This was followed closely by a lot of articles on music. We also found, or the next biggest category was the visual and performing arts. And then the smallest, tiniest category of articles that we found was in the humanities. So in terms of flourishing dimensions, we also saw that the majority of the studies focused on the top 3, as we kind of predicted. But we did find that there were a good number of studies that looked at transcendent and collective flourishing outcomes in this population. So in terms of flourishing dimensions, we found examples of different articles or different dimension. Oh, this didn't actually change, did it? Yes, it did. Sorry, we found examples of television and film, for example, impacting collective well-being. So for example, movies like The Black Panther, or I don't know if any of you saw the hit HBO show Insecure, but we found that there were some articles that showed that watching Black television shows or shows with characters that were Black and storylines that were Black really helped increase Black individuals' sense of ethnic pride, appreciation of their Black identity, and created a sense of hope and resilience. And for a 30-minute TV show or for a 2-hour-long movie, I think that that's incredible. In terms of music, we found that gospel music in some studies positively impacted transcendent well-being by lifting individual spirits. And then also in one study, it also impacted physical well-being by helping women stay clean after drug dependency. So these are just examples of studies that we found in the scoping review. In the visual arts, we found in one study that it positively impacted psychological well-being in a chronic psychiatric patient by allowing him to increase his freedom of expression. And then we found examples in the multimodal arts. There was this article about a quilting circle among a group of Black women, and the quilting circle increased their feelings of social support and really facilitated the building of intentional communities. So I thought that that was a really beautiful piece. But that was just a snapshot of some of the articles that we were finding. It's currently under review, but I can also give you some more information on it if you would like. If the research question for this scoping review were a yes or no question, do the arts impact well-being across 5 dimensions of well-being in Black Americans? The answer would be yes. Because we found evidence of articles that investigated that the arts across all domains had impacts on flourishing in Black Americans across those 5 dimensions of flourishing. But some other key takeaways from the study were that the 2 additional dimensions that I was really interested in studying in Black Americans, collective and transcendent, they were present, but they weren't as present as I hoped. They were showing up, but they were, I thought, underrepresented in this review, particularly when thinking about the population that I was looking at. Another finding was that there were very few studies of the visual arts and its impact on flourishing in Black Americans. And then finally, we found that a lot of the programs that were included in this review were culturally tailored. So they really, we talked about this again a little bit yesterday, they provided participants with programming that really felt meaningful to them because they were a part of the co-creation of the program. And research has shown that this is a key reason for program uptake and success. So after the scoping review, we had a little bit of a better sense of the state of the science, but we also know that certain forms of art and then also certain spaces where the arts are housed can feel really exclusionary, particularly to Black Americans. or really lots of minoritized groups. So we wanted to conduct a survey to get a better sense of, one, how are Black Americans currently engaging in the arts? And then two, what are some potential barriers to engagement? And barriers to engagement can really come in a couple of different forms, but in my mind, I've categorized them into these two forms, visible and invisible. So by visible barriers, I meant, I don't know, barriers that are almost like palpable, or these sort of structural barriers, like the cost of admission being too high, or the distance being too far from someone's house. And then there are also these invisible barriers that I think are really important too. And it's not feeling perhaps a sense of belonging because the place or the exhibit doesn't reflect any aspects of your identity on the wall, and has never made strides to do so. So I thought that this quote was really interesting, the fact that today's museums are grappling with this legacy of colonialism and oppression as the US shifts to becoming a majority minority nation. So I think the question of belonging and inclusion in these spaces is really becoming more important now than it ever has been before. So the second project that I did then was to do a survey of barriers to and engagement with the arts among Black Americans. So we surveyed around 600 Black Americans from across the US that were aged 18 or older. Excuse me, and we asked them some questions around their engagement in the arts and barriers to their engagement. So far we've only done some initial descriptive analyses, and I'll share some of those with you today. So the first question that we asked was, during the past 30 days, which arts domains did you engage in? And as you can see, music, 78 was the highest category that folks indicated. The second biggest category was television and film. And then the third biggest, which was actually kind of surprising to me, were the visual arts. So another thing that we looked at, or we were curious, if individuals only participated in one arts domain over the course of 30 days, which domain was it? And still, most folks engaged in music, but surprisingly, a large number of individuals who only engaged in one domain. The domain, again, was the visual arts. So moving on then to some barriers that folks said that they might experience when engaging with the arts. So we asked, thinking about the most recent art performance, show, or exhibit that you wanted to attend but did not, which of the following factors were important in your decision to not attend? And thinking about this invisible versus visible barriers lens, two of these were visible barriers, or sort of palpable or tangible or structural barriers. The first being that sometimes they cost too much. Another, or the second biggest category was could not find the time, which in some ways can also be structural, just thinking about the fact that if you are a worker that works based on hours, it might be a little bit harder for you to get off work or take the weekends off to go enjoy an art space. And then the final one was that it is too difficult to get there. So we know structurally that museums are often located in these high SES areas. So this begs the question, how can we, if we care about increasing belonging in the arts, make sure that we break down some of these barriers to access? We also asked, in general, would any of these types of changes make arts or cultural organizations better for you in the future? And again, folks indicated having more affordable entry or ticket prices would be one of the ways that it might be a better experience for them. They also indicated that they would be interested in more culturally diverse exhibits and events, but then also just in general, being more welcoming to all kinds of people. And then people were also hungry for exhibits and shows that address these sort of wicked problems that us as a human race are all very interested in solving, I think. So the responses ranged across the board. None drastically stood out more than others, but the highest category was that people were interested in seeing exhibits on systemic and racial injustices. People were also interested in seeing exhibits on mental health and stigma, also income inequality and climate change and natural disasters. So I've kind of covered a lot in this talk, but I wanted to give you this sort of 30,000 foot view, I guess, of where my mind is going in this space. And if you can walk away from this talk remembering anything, I wanted you to think about these two things. The first, it's really clear from the research that there's a value in measuring an expanded set of outcomes for from arts engagement for Black Americans. But I also think that a model like this really expands to all members of the global majority. So if you want to get a really clear picture of the impact of the arts on flourishing, I encourage you to consider adding some of these measures to some of your evaluation. And the second thing is that barriers to the arts are real and sometimes exist at the structural level. So I think it's really important to consider some ways to reduce barriers to entry and then also to increase the diversity of exhibits. So I wanted to end an arts day with one more artsy type of experience. And that's to have you engage in a free write. So I think all of this sort of ties back to the idea of belonging and what does belonging look like in a space. And I wanted you to engage in a free write. I'll tell you the rules in a second, but these are some of the questions that I want you to reflect on as you write. The first, what does belonging look like in practice? The second is, how can we visualize the act of bridging diverse communities through the arts? And finally, what would our organizations look like if we overcame the cleavages that often divide society? So the rules of a free write. First, you have to keep your hand moving the whole time. So don't pause to reread the line that you have just written, then it is no longer a free write, it is just writing. The second thing is, don't cross out and don't erase. That's editing, not writing. Don't worry about your spelling, punctuation, or grammar. This is not being graded. And just lose control. So really try to find this element of flow in this exercise. And when you get a pen and paper ready, and I see that everyone is ready, I will go ahead and start a timer. Do folks need pens? No, we're good. Okay. Paul is ready. All right, you may begin. All right, pens or pencils down. If you can believe it, that was 3 minutes. So I know sometimes writing can be a very personal experience, so please do not feel obligated to share, but if anyone is so inclined, I'd love to hear some of your ideas around what belonging looks like in practice.
I'm definitely someone who feels a sense of belonging in art museums. I work in them. And yet I recently went to New York and I visited the Met and I instantly felt that I was not welcome there because of just the attitudes of like the coat check staff, security staff, like I was like, I had this with me and I was told I couldn't bring it into the museum, but I couldn't leave it in the coat check either. And it's just like more human understanding when you walk in the door, like they're like our security team has a certain set of criteria for success that doesn't match our goals to make the place a welcoming building. Right. It's very focused on keeping people out and keeping the artwork safe. So change that all up.
Prioritizing humans.
Yeah.
I had something around what belonging looks like,
Mhm.
and this kind of comes from a hospitality, like tourism background standpoint. But the idea that like many different people find belonging in the same place through different elements. And so people will connect with, and they might be psychosocial, they might be physical, but different pieces or elements or things. And that you kind of need those magnetic things that different people will find and that will be attractors for them, but we need to keep in mind that there needs to be a scattering of them. So like one, I can't remember which speaker was talking about having these dangling tactile elements for people who are low or no vision. So like there's many different touch points that we kind of sprinkle through that create sense of belongings for different people who resonate with them, I guess. Well, I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to rather end with this quote, because someone recently asked me what I hoped comes out of the research I do, essentially. And primarily, I, like bell hooks, dream about this culture of belonging in all spaces, but also certainly in the world of arts and culture. And I really believe that our cultures and institutions really should reflect the diversity that exists within the United States and also in the world. So she says, I dreamed about a culture of belonging. I still dream that dream. I contemplate what our lives would look like if we knew how to cultivate awareness, to live mindfully, peacefully, if we learned the habits of being that would bring us closer together, that would help us build beloved community. So I wanted to end by plugging an event that I'm doing next week with the Arthur Ross Gallery. So it'll be on Saturday, May 4th from 1 to 2 p.m. I'm going to be leading a wellness workshop. So it'll be a little bit of talking, a little bit of yoga. So if you're interested, please let me know, or I can send you the link to RSVP. Thank you.